Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the disappearance of Mei and Fusako Shigenobu. My name is Daisuke Miyao, Director of Film Studies. On behalf of Film Studies, Japanese Studies, Visual Arts, the Democracy Lab, and the Dean of Arts and Humanities, I'd like to welcome you all. The UC San Diego community holds great respect for the land and the original people of the area where our campus is located. The university was built on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. Today, the Kumeyaay people continue to maintain their political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We acknowledge their tremendous contributions to our region and thank them for their stewardship. It is a great pleasure to have Dr. Mei Shigenobu with us today. I am super excited because I rewatched the film by Eric Baudelaire, The Anabasis of Mei and Fusako Shigenobu, Masao Adachi, and 27 Years Without Images yesterday, and was fully intrigued not only by its content, but also by its style of narration that uses the parallel editing in a deconstructive manner, and connects and simultaneously disconnects the spatial distance between Lebanon and Japan, the temporal gap between now and then, memory and history, fiction and documentary, image and sound, private and public, real and unreal, and here and there. Before discussing the film in detail, please let me introduce Dr. Mei Shigenobu. Dr. Shigenobu received her PhD in media studies from Doshisha University in Kyoto, Japan in 2011, the same year when this film was released. Dr. Shigenobu is a journalist, author, political analyst, TV news anchor, and media producer with particular expertise in the Middle East. She was born in Lebanon and has written extensively about media in the Middle East for both scholarly and journalistic publication. Dr. Shigenobu is the daughter of Fusako Shigenobu, political activist who founded the left-wing factor Japanese Red Army and led the Popular Front for the liberation of Palestine in Beirut for almost 30 years until she was arrested in the year 2000. She is scheduled to be released this year, 2022. Dr. Shigenobu is currently a visiting scholar, although remotely, in the Department of Media and Cultural Studies at the University of California, Riverside. I'd like to thank Dr. Setsu Shigematsu and Dr. Anne McKnight from UC Riverside, the hosts of Dr. Shigenobu, who will lead our discussions today. Dr. Setsu Shigematsu is Associate Professor of Media and Cultural Studies at UCR, who is an expert in the historical relationship between US and Japanese imperialism, transnational liberation movements, and comparative feminist and critical theory. She's the author of Scream from the Shadows, the women's liberation movement in Japan. Dr. Anne McKnight is professor in comparative literature at the UCR, specializing in post-1945 American and Japanese literatures. Her publications include Nakagami, Japan, Buraku, and the Writing of Ethnicity. Dr. Judith Rodenbeck, Chair of Media and Cultural Studies, UCR, my colleague, Dr. Lisa Cartwright, Director of Art Practice, PhD, UCSD, and I will be the discussion moderators.
The opportunity to honor Mei and Fusako Shigenobu at this moment in history when Fusako Shigenobu and Mei Shigenobu may be reunited for the first time in, is it 16 years, Mei? Is that correct?
It is 22 years and a half.
Wow. 22 years and a half. They will soon be reunited. And so I thank my colleague, Anna Gloria Rodriguez, for offering Mei and Fusako Shigenobu a blessing on behalf of the community. Ana Gloria Rodriguez is a member of the San Jose de la Zora Kumeyaay community and a leader in San Diego in women's organizing and border wall resistance, as well as in promoting the living, socially engaged art of basketry and pottery through the Kosai Kumeyae market. Ana Gloria will give a blessing, and we welcome you.
Okay. Thank you, Yeyahan. My haye hampung nasha nyawa shamas de hampi. My hat decay kuwu shaaka nentel shaaka kunywe. Decay shesh buki nyawa shamas pugnasha nyawa shamas de hampi mat kwarkwar nyapum shaaka nentel. Awachupit matuan kwaslawar. Shesh bukin shaaka nentel pugnasha nyup kwahan. My heart decay shell pukin nyawet shamil ye hampug nashes nyawet sepir nyawet pi chaaka e pas sepir my to yaw tipe you meet sepir shell pukin my hampug nashes nyaw tipe kwaslawar spa nyawo nyapum awashupit matuan kwaslawar ahano mau shell pukin my ha so chaaka kunyowe shamil ahanta nywe my heart, shesh pukinya way shamas a hantanwe, supirtanwe. Yeyahan, my heart. Thank you very much. Yeyahan.
Thank you, Martha. Ana Gloria Rodriguez. And so Dr. Shigenobu, yesterday at our women's circle that Martha leads, we spoke of you and your mother, and we are thinking of you and look toward the release. We now welcome to the screen Dr. Judith Rodenbeck from Riverside.
Good morning, everybody. Good evening, May. And thank you for those wonderful greetings and the blessing as well. On behalf of my colleagues in the Department of Media and Cultural Studies at UC Riverside, I'm delighted to participate in this event. My role today is as a very quiet moderator in the background, but I thought I would start for a few minutes by just laying out some of the terms that orient the film that generates this event, Eric Baudelaire's film, The Anabasis of Mei and Fusako Shigenobu, Masao Adachi, and 27 Years Without Images from 2011. This is an essay film that takes its title from a term explored by the French philosopher Alain Badiou, and as its moving image ethos, the theory of Foucault that Lisa has already alluded to, a landscape theory associated with the filmmaker Adachi. And it's a theory of the moving image that proposes straightforwardly that the representation of landscape presents a critique of capital and all its depredations in a way that is much more effective and, at the time of the formulation of the theory, true to the effects of capital than the representation of individual figures. So there are two issues. One is Foucault, which we'll talk about a little bit today. And then the second is Anabasis, and I wanted to just provide a very basic layout of what that strange word is. So parsing the philosopher Alain Badiou, I will say he parses the Greek word anabasis as a re-ascent towards the source, an exiled experience of beginning. So it's about a kind of exile and return. He gets the word from Xenophon's narrative of a troop of Greek mercenaries enlisted in a Persian dynastic war. Quoting Badiou, their Persian employer is killed, he writes, And the Greek mercenaries are left alone in the heart of an unknown country, bereft of any local support or pre-established destination. Anabasis will be the name for their homeward movement, the movement of lost men out of place and outside the law. From this, Badiou extrapolates three main points. One, at the root of Anabasis lies something like a principle of lostness, especially of being foreigners in a hostile country and with loss of initial purpose. Two, having lost initial purpose, survival necessitates not just self-reliance, but the invention of one's own destiny. And three, the free invention of a wandering path that is at once a return home and a brand new route. He performs a reading of the poet Celan, and in that reading, he concludes, through the becoming ours of an almost imperceptible call, the Anabasis is the advent as togetherness of a we that is not an I. So it's a concept that is about a kind of alienation that somehow then yields a collectivity. And he concludes, and this is the key to the temporal location of this film, from the end of the 70s onwards, the century has bequeathed us the following question: what is a we that is not subject to the ideal of an I, a we that does not pretend to be a subject? In doing that, he's restating the famous little remark of Arthur Rimbaud, "Je est un autre," I am another. And I think it's worth meditating on not just Rimbaud, who spent some of his last years in North Africa, and the notion of self-alienation as a kind of foundational notion for the 20th century and for a kind of wandering. But Badiou himself has origins in North Africa. As a sort of colonial French person. So there's a very interesting relationship established already with the Arab world and Francophonie in this text that Eric Baudelaire has chosen for the title of his film. There are two other films that need to be put in circulation, I think, in thinking about the subject matter of the Baudelaire film and the film itself. And one is Jean-Luc Godard and Anne-Marie Miéville's Ici et Ailleurs from 1976, a film that was originally commissioned to be made by the PFLP as a sort of propaganda film for the Palestinian cause. And then the filmmaker understood the notion of him importing himself to that context was not correct. So the title Ici et Ailleurs, Here and Elsewhere, kind of brings that to the fore. And then the second film that is more vital, I think, is Koji Wakamatsu and Masao Adachi's The Red Army PFLP Declaration of War, 1971, on which the Baudelaire film absolutely relies for its deployment of landscape and some of the footage, not just footage itself, but the scripting of camera movement through the space of Beirut. So that's Fouqueyron and some background. The second piece I want to drop in here is that we have to bear in mind as well that Lebanon was in civil war from 1975 to 1990, which is to say, the tendency is to date the fall of the Berlin Wall and Tiananmen Square, 1989, as a sort of closure of one aspect of 20th century history. And in the case of Lebanon, we really have to bear in mind that there was a civil war up through 1990. That situation, in turn, has generated a very robust image culture in Beirut. And I look particularly to the Arab Image Foundation in operation for the last 20 years. It's an image culture that that is dramatically cinephilic, but also has built a series of archives that are themselves based on attempts to salvage 20th century and late 19th century archives of photographs, studio photographs and snapshots, and in particular to salvage photographs from studios in Palestine before those images disappear. So the notion of images disappearing is fully present in the Beiruti context as an actuality for a visual history of Palestine and the area more broadly. And I point particularly to the work of Walid Rad, of Akram Zatari as signal projects examining those questions along with the works of Lamia Jorej and their colleagues. So the disappearance of images is both personal, as we will talk about later today. It's also a sort of broader cognate of an actual population within the area of the Levant that we're talking about. I'd like to invite Mei Shigenobu. It's my great honor to be speaking with you today. The very first thing I'd like to do is just ask if you could tell us a little bit about the background of the film title and perhaps your involvement with the film in the first place. I think that would be really helpful.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Lisa, and thank you, Dr. Daisuke, for this warm introduction. Thank you, Anna Gloria, for the blessing. Hello, everyone. First of all, as you mentioned, the title, it's a long title, 27 Years Without Images. But the reason for this title comes from the fact that me and my mother were not carrying images of each other for 27 years. This 27 years is meaning from the day I was born until the day I was out in public and disclosed my true identity. If we carry each other's photos or photos of us together, this would have meant very, very possible danger, because in case either of us were captured or both of us were captured, but in case if that happens, then it means that the enemy, whoever it is, the Israelis or the authorities or whoever, would have access to know the other person's image or information about, let's say, the other person. So I was forbidden to carry photographs of my mother or of us together. So now I'm just, allow me to just show briefly an image or a frame that Eric Baudelaire actually created as a part of an installation that goes with the film, showing why he called the film 27 Years Without Images. And it's a whole big frame where you have pictures of my mother's history. I'll show this, allow me to share the screen. So this is in my house. So Eric Baudelaire was very kind to give me the frame after this whole installation. This was The first installation of the film and the exhibition, or the installation, was done in Beirut Art Center for about a month and a half. And in this time, this frame and the other parts of the installation was exhibited there. The installation shows, as you might see on the screen, a series of pictures of my mother since she was a child, even before she was born, her grandfather's image. Then she was very young among her family, three siblings. And then the stage where she comes to Beirut. Here's the stages where she is in Beirut in the final 3-4 pictures. And then you see a picture of me at the end where I lay in her arms, just born, newly born. So this is the frame that was introducing the 27 years of without images. Now, to go back to the context of this. So he was very focused on the audio of the film. As Adachi says in the film, he was kind of scenario hunting through the storytelling of my interview. And at the initial stage, it was, he approached me through common people or common friends. And he approached me to do a kind of a long series of interviews filmed, but more focused on the quality of the audio. And through listening to the audio, he wanted to have a kind of knowledge about the story and then create the story. And then after recording all this, and you can see from listening to the film, I don't appear in the film. I only speak about the story of my life. Unlike the original serial killer landscape film, you find that I'm always talking about my own story, unlike a narrator in that film. And then after filming my part, he was interested in also approaching Adachi and Masao and filming with him and having him integrated in the whole story of this narrative or narration of the film. And in the film, Adachi mentions that he lost a lot of footage he was taking while he was in Beirut, living in Beirut, because mostly he wanted to create another film other than the 2 films he had already created, trying to follow, for example, children that are growing in front of his eyes, growing to become young men, perhaps becoming fighters, fida'in. But every time something happened around us, we had to destroy things. We had to destroy photographs of ours. And in that process, he had lost a lot of his footage. And the footage he lost was shot in Super 8mm films. And that is why he is taking the film, the images in that kind of style. And he is creating a kind of a collage, like the frame that you just saw in my house, a collage of archival footage, a collage of probable landscapes that we have lived in or were in, and then a lot of footage of Japan, actually. Maybe some of you recognize Japan footage in the film. So that's how the film was introduced. I have other images that I would like to introduce, maybe perhaps when I'm further on in the conversation, photographs. One more thing I would like to share with the audience as we talk about the images is, let me allow the screen to share first. So this is a quote from my mother from prison. About her becoming a political prisoner. But the picture I want to show is this. So this is the picture this is the only picture we both held together, my mother and I, all through the time that I was growing up, because this did not show features of our faces. So this was just the picture that we could carry. And we also used as a kind of a code in case we needed to send each other, a sign that, I'm sending a messenger. So this photo would be given to the messenger as a sign of trusted person. So this was what happened when the lawyer visited us in Lebanon at the end when my mother was already arrested.
I wanted to throw out a couple of things about Fukeiron or landscape theory part 1. And so we can kind of get a handle on those and then put them aside and pick up the parts that I think may sort of the film, your narration, as you said, and your presence in the film really takes the whole idea of Fukeiron in a very different direction, right? So originally this term referred to films around the late 1960s, but what's really important is that a lot of genres in Japanese cinema, if you're coming from this context, are about the object. There's jiraigeki, right? Old materials, haha mono, stuff about sentimental melodramas about mothers. But what's really interesting about Fukeiron is that ron means debates, right? So it's a discursive category in which the film is actually trying to produce a debate and conduct a debate on its own terms. So the concept really pulls everything together as much as the materials do. And I think this is really important to keep in mind, that it's about narration and re-narration and the telling of stories, and that it's this concept that Eric Baudelaire and Mei and Adachi Masao, who's sort of in the ground in this figure and ground sort of diagram I'm giving you, but it's that focus on narration and re-narration, like about disappearance, reappearance, and the conditions that allow that to happen, because this is a conceptually driven film, right? And I got sort of drawing on thinking about the couple of things that are so different are your voice and your not just the contents of your voice, but the kind of reflexivity and the degree of kind of reflection and the way we can kind of hear you thinking in process as you're speaking. And I wanted to show like a brief clip of about 10 seconds that that shows this process to have a sort of point of reference, just really briefly. And this is a shot taken inside an apartment. I'm not, as per a lot of landscape theory, I'm not sure if it's specific or it's generic, but your voice is talking about sort of the different relationship to photographs as documents that you're required to have over the course of those 27 years. So.
Sometimes pictures weren't that good an asset to keep when you're moving around. It had many information in them, many people who you're with in the picture, the places you're at in the picture. And so many of the pictures got burnt every time we got to move to a different place. We always felt that someday we'll be able to keep pictures. Anyway, when we used to get rid of pictures, we didn't get rid of everything. We would keep very, very small sum of pictures that didn't indicate anything or didn't give out any information. And eventually those were the ones that were that remained.
In this clip, you're talking about this sort of powerful but potentially dangerous relationship with the document that Lisa talked about regarding her class. And I wonder, could you just talk a little bit about the conversation, how the conversation actually happened as you were making the film? Was it a Q&A type thing? Were you looking at photographs as you were talking? Or was it more a contemplative sort of conversation?
No, it was actually all the filming was taking place in a studio, a sound studio, focused on really having the best quality sound. No, I was not looking at photos, and that frame that you have just showed us is actually a generic, and I actually know where it is. It is the inside the house or the kitchen of the assistant director / producer of Eric Baudelaire in Lebanon. Because I visited that place later while filming the ugly one for Adachi and Eric Baudelaire. No, the photos that are there are not necessarily, or the kitchen or the room that's there is not necessarily relevant to my life, but it is a generic kind of film. It was as Adachi Masao says in the film, he asks Eric Baudelaire, because Eric Baudelaire actually asked Adachi to give him a list of places he wants to be shot for the film, so as to shoot the film in the eyes of Adachi Masao for the part he's talking. However, and on my part, when he asked me, I told him that I cannot reveal any locations. You can ask me, but I will not be able to share any previous locations. So for this, Eric Baudelaire had to create his own imagination of where we might have been, the possible places of where we might have been. And even Adachi tells him, I cannot tell you because I cannot imagine things that have changed or have not changed, because the landscape changes in so many years. It's not like the old buildings are still there, especially the ones that were bombed or destroyed or etc. He says in the film, the only thing that is a constant in the life of Lebanon was the Palestinian camps. So that's the only thing that's remained as it is, but the rest, the other things and places and buildings and structures might have possibly changed. So it was Eric Baudelaire filming Beirut. Beirut is a small city, so he was filming streets and alleyways and places and homes, thinking that this might be the place that Adachi and Mei were talking about.
I apologize if the film didn't translate as a moving image, but what was happening is that it pans down through the postcards, and Mei's narration is about very reflective and seemed to be improvisational about the important documentary value, but the danger of being identified through those photos. So insofar as there's a storiness to the film, the film begins with you talking about how you actually began as a small child re-narrating things. What does it mean to know the sun? And so that quality of your re-narration is very poetic and very, very much threaded through the piece, I think. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about kind of what sort of, did you prepare for the film, or was it primarily just conversation between you and Eric Baudelaire in the studio? Was it improvisational, or was it
It was completely improvisational. It was not, I didn't even know the questions until I sat on the chair and heard it from Eric Baudelaire on the spot with the camera on, of course. So yeah, I had no preparation whatsoever for any of the things that were mentioned in the film.
Thanks.
And regarding the security, yes, it is, as I mentioned, yes, because of the security situation and because we had to hide our identity, we had to change identities. Like, for example, even as a child, I had to change my name, my nationality, my school, my neighborhood every now and then, which could be sometimes in the span of a month or two. Sometimes it could last a year. But it was a very constant change and shift of identity, so that just to stay alive within the context of being underground and, could possibly being targeted.
So that narration, that idea of reflection and re-narration of your own identity was very much a survival strategy.
Yes.
I would like to maybe shift over from that, talking about the film, to asking about your present career, which, as Daisuke noted, you're a working journalist, and as such are working with the materials of sound and image and interviews all the time. And I wonder if you might be able to talk a bit about how your lived experience has informed your investments in both the topics that you take on and also the way you work with kinds of knowing media literacy on the other side, but also knowing your own ability to sort of to re-narrate through these techniques of image, sound and image production.
So yes, I know that, you know, when you become a journalist or when you become a media specialist and you also study it more extensively, you start to understand that even a single word could completely frame the context of the whole, let's say, film or the documentary or the report. So choosing words are very important in my field, I think, and choosing the words, because you as a journalist or a producer, it's never possible to be objective. It's always choosing, you know, in the minute you're choosing your witnesses, your talking heads, your images, even your rushes or the things that you want to fill in between, let's say, talking points or talking heads. These choices are not objective. Whatever you do, it's a choice. So there is not possible, it's not possible to be very objective. However, it's possible for you to be careful about not either steering misunderstandings or, you know, strengthening any kind of stereotypes, or giving justice to people who might be sometimes misunderstood because of their inability to be expressing themselves on the media, or inability to have the chance to be exposed to the media most of the time. So that's where I really try to be careful and pay attention when I'm making something or creating something. It's not just about finding a story and just shooting whatever there is. It's about really being sensitive and caring and understanding of the topic and the subjects in the topic. I guess this is especially important for me because I grew up in a life where we were misunderstood. We were on the other side of the coin, if you want. We were the people who were misunderstood, framed, you know, with propaganda, or if you want, you know, had so many narratives that were against our narratives. So coming from there, coming from a life where your mother is called a terrorist, but you see the character in front of you is obviously her or the community are very humane people. I mean, like, all they're thinking about is the other. They're sacrificing their normal life for, you know, solidarity with the underdog or the oppressed. And in this case, the Palestinians who have been oppressed for so long. And so this kind of idea of, you know, trying to really be sensitive for details and the framing and the narrative it came from the way I lived my life, I guess.
Thank you.
I just want to begin by thanking Lisa and Judith, Daisuke, and Ana Gloria for your blessing for this day, and especially for Fusako and Mei. I want to just begin by talking about the reason why I proposed this particular title for this event as a point of departure to not only highlight the disappearance of Mei and Fusako and their historic reappearance, but to also discuss how artists, filmmakers, academics, and the media have been complicit in this facile and inaccurate framing of Fusako harming both mother and daughter, and as well how, you know, academics, again, journalists, artists, filmmakers have been active agents in reinforcing the institutions, apparatuses, and languages of state violence. So, for example, even the filmmaker under discussion today, like many other reporters and academics, labels Fusako a terrorist in his synopsis versus that of a political prisoner. And of course, we know that many communists and leftist intellectuals and leaders have been not only criminalized, but even assassinated by the state for their resistance. So for myself, I clearly position Fusako in a genealogy of other political prisoners, such as Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, and Nelson Mandela. And I also have created a few images to share with you today, just to help clarify some of my talking points. So I was just referring to the fact that I position Fusako in a genealogy with other political prisoners, such as Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, and Nelson Mandela, all of whom governments have considered murderers or terrorists, with Assata Shakur still considered a fugitive. So part of my project in working with Mei is to engage in this important work of reframing Fusako as a political prisoner. And so I just want to draw upon Angela Davis's definition of a political prisoner that she offers in her book, If They Come in the Morning. So this quote is a bit long, but if you can just bear with me. I specifically chose this quote because knowing Mei and watching her as she engages in all of these difficult obstacles in interviews in speaking, about her mother for all these years, this particular definition by Angela really resonates, I think, with what Mei has been saying for many years. So I would like to just take the time to read it. So this quote from Angela Davis states, "At stake has been the collective welfare and survival of a people. There is a distinct and qualitative difference between one breaking a law for one's individual self-interest and violating it in the interests of a class or a people. A revolutionary is interested in universal social change. Captured, he or she is a political prisoner. The political prisoner's words or deeds in one form or another embodied political protests against the established order and have consequently brought him or her into acute conflict with the state. The political prisoner has violated the unwritten law, which prohibits disturbances and upheavals in the status quo of exploitation and racism. Charged and tried for a criminal act, his or her guilt is always political in nature." End of quote. So similar to Angela, who was being hunted down by the FBI and was forced to go underground, now I shift to discuss Fusako and Mei's forced disappearance that began during the same time that Angela had been captured and put on trial. The slash between disappearance in the title signifies the cut and the break, the forced disappearance of mother and daughter due to the threat of assassination by the Israeli military. In her first book, Written from Prison as a Revolutionary Mother, this was the 6th book that she had written from captivity and or underground, Fusako fills in the story of her life with her daughter in this beautifully titled work, I Decided to Give Birth to You Under an Apple Tree. In this work, Fusako explains why she had to go underground, being targeted for assassination. In this work, she describes how the Israeli military bombed the house that she was living in. And fortunately, she was not home at the time, but others were injured and survived this surprise attack. Given what we know about such regular Israeli attacks and massacres of Palestinians, my first point is to discuss the complicity of academics with such brutal state violence. In the field of Japan studies, sociologist Patricia Steinhoff has been the leading architect of the master narratives that frame Japanese revolutionaries as quote unquote terrorists beginning in the mid-70s, a framing repeated by 50 years of media that reinforces police state rhetoric. So although she began this type of work in the mid-70s, it was only more than 3 decades later, in 2007, that Steinhoff acknowledged during an interview that she was given privileged access to the site of the operation at Lid Airport, and that based on what she saw, it appeared that civilians were likely killed by being caught in Israeli security crossfire. But the Israelis did not allow for an independent investigation to figure out who was responsible for killing whom. Instead, they entirely blamed and framed the 3 Japanese for what they characterized as senseless violence. I call scholars such as these embedded academics who create narratives that support the carceral state. At a time in history when truth is going to be revealed, I think it's time for academics to retract their inaccurate and harmful narratives. Those who have devised and propagated master narratives, who work in sync with and in support of the police state and militarized colonization, I'm asking you, come clean, because even those professors at San Diego, like Chalmers Johnson, who's probably one of the best well-known people who acknowledged that he worked as a consultant for the CIA. So perhaps academics should be conducting research to hold government and police accountable rather than help covering up their crimes. So the next pivotal point that I want to share today is that this operation has never been properly reported. Specifically, I need to share that the target of the Lid operation was actually the head of Israeli military biological weapons development, Aaron Katzir. Aaron Katzir was close with Ben-Gurion, and his brother became the future president of Israel, so he was the farthest thing from a quote-unquote innocent civilian. In fact, he was an architect, advocate, and an agent for weapons of mass murder. And I have a binder full of articles that I've collected and studies that demonstrate Aaron Katzir's involvement in the development of biological weapons, which, as we know, is against international law, which forbids the use and development of chemical and biological weapons. And hence, he was fully engaged in criminal activities to harm Palestinian men, women, and children. And in this next slide here, I just want to remind us that as the International Red Cross states, biological and chemical weapons have been banned by the international community since World War I and renewed in the 70s and in the 90s, but not coincidentally, the planner of this operation at Lid, Wadi Haddad, was killed, poisoned by Zionist biological weapons. May he rest in peace. And finally, as an abolitionist feminist, I want to acknowledge a genealogy of freedom fighters from Harriet Tubman to Leila Khalid, and it is high time that we collectively affirm the right and the righteousness of such forceful resistance. And although it's not necessary to rely on necessarily, right, the legitimation of something like the UN, but in this case, this is not the Security Council, this is the General Assembly. So I just want to take the time to reiterate this General Assembly right of people's self-determination, which states that considering that the denial of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, sovereignty, independence, and return to Palestine, and the repeated acts of aggression by Israel against the people, this right of people's self-determination explicitly states that Palestinians should be allowed to fight for liberation from colonial domination and apartheid, using all means, including the right to armed struggle. So I know that I would like to ask Mei now to perhaps share with us more about Fusako's stance and ethics regarding armed struggle, because I think that this is still an issue that has been acknowledged even among feminist circles.
Yes, thank you, Setsu. First of all, as I return to your question with regards to the armed struggle, my mother is and the Japanese Red Army are supporters of the armed struggle for the liberation of people who are under oppression, under occupation. And this is something that is also stated in the United Nations as a General Assembly decision, which was taken in 1984. So this, in this sense, the armed struggle is part of any liberation. It's a right of any liberation, but it's not the only way of solidarity. So, for example, as the Japanese who are in solidarity with the Palestinians, and as a group that was first taking part in armed struggle, in the early stages of my mother being in Lebanon and in solidarity with the PFLP and the Palestinian people, she actually started to work with Ghassan Kanafani. And in her early stage, we're talking about the time before the LID operation. She was working with Ghassan Kanafani because some of the Japanese who came here were volunteering in all directions. So, for example, in her case, she was volunteering in the information transmission with Ghassan Kanafani in the English section of Al-Hadab magazine. And so she was, because the thing that happened was that when she was when she arrived in Lebanon, and after a while she hears about the lynching accident in Japan, where activists and leftist students in inner fighting caused the lynching and killing of each other, just because they were trying to accuse each other of not being leftist enough, communist enough, Marxist enough. So she was shocked, her and Okudaira Tsuyoshi, who just arrived in Lebanon in solidarity with the Palestinians. So she thought that what she learned from the Palestinians actually is much more important than the fight over ideology and theoretical preciseness and sticking to the right path of the ideology. She thought that, as Adachi mentions in the film also, she saw that how the Palestinians struggling and fighting the Israeli came in many forms. It came in the form of resistance, in the form of surviving oppression, even when they're refugees in other countries. It came in the form of, for example, elderlies teaching their young ones or their grandsons the history of Palestine, what they recall about Palestine, what they recall about their villages. This is part of also resistance, not to forget your homeland. For women, it's also about, again, teaching the culture, the ethics of the Palestinians, all the stories that they know, the narratives. They always wanted to inherit these things with their children, to inherit this. This was also part of the struggle. And the fighters were not crammed in somewhere alone and, just talking about ideology. They were people who were living with their families, sharing their will to fight and resist the Israelis from their homes, talking about all this with their wives, their children in their kitchens. And this is how she learned this is how people should be resisting any kind of oppression. It should be a collective thing. It should not be reduced to only the elites or the people who are intellectuals in ideological matters. It's always a collective communal thing. And this is how she kind of, even this is the picture of the 3 members of the Japanese Red Army who went into the lid operation. And the man in the middle is Tsuyoshi Okudaira, the leader of the team. And the man on the left is Kozo Okamoto Kozo, who is the famous person, I guess, in the Arab world. Then, on the other hand, these 3 men decided that they will also send a message to the Japanese people that the ethics of really solidarity and armed struggle is not against each other. It is with each other against the enemy, even by sacrificing their lives. If this meant that they have to die for it, they have to die for it. But it has to be all the way. This is a picture of where, after the lid operation, Adachi, from the director of the film, and Wakamatsu Koji is the man on the far left of the picture, and my mother in the middle of the right side of the picture. So this is where the filmmakers decided to come and take footage of what's going on with the fighters, Palestinian life, to create this film that is called the PFLP, Japanese Red Army Declaration of War. So when they were creating this film, after filming everything, they were not allowed to film in the beginning, but when they left, they were left at the beginning, they didn't allow them to film. This was in Jarash mountains of Jordan. And after a while, the leader of the Jarash mountain at the time, Abu Ali Mustafa, asked them to film everything in one day and one night and to leave immediately. They did not know why this was requested of them, but they filmed as much as they could. And that's what you see in the film of this. And this is where they interviewed the comrade and the dear friend of mine and my mother, Layla Khalid, who might also be among our audience today. So this was taken while shooting the film. The man on the right is Wakamatsu Koji when he was very young, and my mother and Layla Khalid. So they were creating this film, and then they fled to Lebanon. And after they arrive in Lebanon, they hear about the massacre of what happened in Jarash Mountain. The people who they've been filming, eating with, training with, having conversations with were mostly massacred by both the Jordanian authorities and the Israelis. So that's where Adachi decided to create this film as in memory for all the people they met, and as a collaboration with my mother to start again emitting information about Palestine, about what's the struggle about, and again to kind of re-educate the left in Japan that was all driven into inner fighting. And so another thing they did was my mother wrote this book. This was her first book, which was My Love, My Revolution. And she talks about all this, about her experience in the Jarash Mountain, about her experience of coming here, about her shock of hearing about the comrades killing themselves back in Japan, and her decision that she will never go back to Japan. She will sacrifice all her life in solidarity with the Palestinian people and learning from them at the same time. And then I was born. And so when I was born, she had to protect her child. And so she never registered my existence to any authorities. So I was underground from the day I was born. And she had to, always try to be there. She was there with me for most of my early, 8 years of my life with the Japanese Red Army community, living a very idealistic kind of, life, I think. We would, share duties. There is no female and male duty. There is always sharing of all duties all the time, from cooking to cleaning, and also having very political discussions, and also having self-criticism discussions in the middle. And this was always done, even including me. Self-criticism here was not about accusing each other of what they did wrong, but looking into yourself, how you could have changed what you did today. Have you hurt anyone by saying something today? Have you done something that you could have done better for other people today? That was the purpose of the self-criticism session. And I grew sometimes in the camps, sometimes outside the camps. This is a time where I was still with the Japanese community, and also when I was with my mother, until I think a little earlier than when Kozo Okamoto was released. That's where more attention was, again paid, and for security, because they needed to now really protect Kozo Okamoto also from any assassinations and any kind of attempts, plus protecting the children. It wasn't just me who had to also move around and shift identities. And while doing that, we had to really, for example, when I suddenly have to move from one place to another, I was only allowed to pack a small bag. So this small bag was the only thing I could move around with. And even if you have accumulated diaries, photographs, letters from friends and lovers, whatever you had, these had to all go because they had your name on it, descriptions of something on it, etc. So every time we had to move, we had to shift and change, throw away all our valuables. The only reason I have pictures of my mother and I when now of the ones I'm showing you is because my mother had decided that some of these pictures had to be left for history. And this is why she decided that she would give them to some lawyers and people who are very much trusted. So she distributed a few pictures among people, lawyers, friends who are trusted, etc., so that one day when we need to, they will all be collected from them. We would not have them with us. And that's how at the end, when she was arrested, and I showed you the picture of us together, this was the picture the lawyer, my mother's lawyer, used when she arrived in Lebanon to show me that she is a trusted lawyer, not an agent of the government, that my mother sent her to me so that I could start creating my identity. And this is the picture of where I was signing documents for the Japanese government for the first time to get my true identity. After going back to Japan, I was, I have been active in always describing the Palestinian cause, the fight, everything that was happening as much as I could to the Japanese public and people and university students so that more people would know. And I would continue in my mother's footsteps of letting people know, because once they know, they will act. So that's the important part. And recently, this film was created, Children of the Revolution, in which me and Adachi were featured, and as well as Enrika Meinhof's daughter and her story. And then, yes, so this is my story and how it happened. In terms of ethics, going back to Setsu's conversation, sorry that it took me so long to go to this point, is that they had always in front of me, it would always be, of course, after 1974, because that is when actually the Japanese Red Army was created. So after this time, even though it is the name itself existed after the LID operation, but the actual entity was created after 1974, after the Hague operation. And that's where Japanese members and volunteers for the PFLP decided to become one entity. And in this, they had always decided, and even before with Wadia Haddad, it has always been their main target, not to harm civilians. So you have many instances where they had to kill themselves so that the civilians that were in their hostages, for example, were not going to be harmed whatsoever. So it is very different from what we hear in the media, and it is very different from, let's say, Al-Qaeda and all these groups where their major concern is to harm as many people. Mm-hmm. Here, the major concern was to attract as much attention from the media. But then in the late 80s, if you've noticed in history, the Japanese Red Army ceases to do any kind of armed struggle out at this time. The reason for this, and this is kind of internal information at the time, was because they shifted. They thought that doing armed struggle for them, at least, they supported for the Palestinians, for liberation, everything. But they thought that once they are doing hijacking and all that, even though they are attracting attention, but unfortunately, most of the time it is being framed in a negative way. So it might be also harming the Palestinian cause when, only time they appear in the news is when it's a hijacking or hostage taking. So this is why they try to focus more on the humanitarian side, which they never stopped from day one, which was sending out medics, opening clinics in camps, teaching acupuncture in the Palestinian camps, having art exhibitions, teaching art, making collaborative theaters and plays, writing books, writing articles. All these things were happening from day one. But then they decided that this would increase more grassroots support for the Palestinian cause as Japanese. So they kind of shifted from more attracting news attention, which is not going to do the Palestinian cause any justice except labeling people as terrorists and not really doing justice to the Palestinian cause within the frame of the news. So they shifted from doing that to really concentrating on humanitarian causes. And if you look at it, it is kind of like what the NGOs does today, except that in that time they had more in their mind the thought of doing this within the framework of solidarity, internationalism, anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, and anti-colonial settler colonialism. So this is the ethics that my mother and the Japanese Red Army were active in this kind of framework. Setsu?
Thank you so much for also sharing with all of us those very precious and treasured few photographs of you and your mom. And I could not help but comment or want to comment on the fact that, I love the photo of her holding you as a newborn baby and the other photo with her arm around you. And, this just leads me to, one of my final comments that I wanted to make today, because I know that in the 22 years that she has been imprisoned by the Japanese government, you told me that there has only been one time that you were even allowed to touch her. And that touch took place within a prison hospital. And so I just want to conclude, and soon we will be opening up, to Q&A. But just as a kind of final way to comment, I want to mention that, of course, as a feminist abolitionist, I am absolutely opposed to this kind of state enforced separation of mothers, daughters, fathers, and children that we see not only in prisons, but of course, in what we call, ICE detention centers, which are essentially border prisons. And so given the fact that in about 88 days, you are going to have this long-awaited final reunion with your mother. I'm so excited for you. And I just actually wanted to also mention to the audience that tomorrow also happens to be Mei's birthday. And so with that kind of also anticipation, I wanted to actually give her a little bit of a surprise, which is something that, I was making, assuming that she was going to be able to come here in person. And so what I've done here is collected a lot of the photos of Mei and her mother. But not only that, collecting these photos is that what I've done behind the photos, because I think that she's been, kept in silence for so long, is to put some of my favorite quotes from Fusako on the back.
That's beautiful. That's so beautiful.
So this is just one step in the project of reframing who your mother is. And for example, the one with Leila Khaled, it says, "Love is a shared foundation. our comrades, our family. And so many of these quotes are about your mother's idea and philosophy of love and non-heteronormative notions of family. If I could just read one more up here. Beyond blood relations, family is born from mutual support and understanding among those with shared experiences and time devoted to giving one's life to protect each other. So for me, I'm, learning so much about your mother's philosophy, and I'm trying to think about her praxis as a certain kind of anti-imperialist radical feminism, which includes, armed struggle as a anti-colonial feminist praxis. So with that being said, just one final image that I would like to show to the audience, just to introduce to them the fact that since Mei has been here as a visiting scholar, we have been discussing for some time about how can we best support. Her mother will soon be coming out of prison, and there's still going to be so much violence directed towards her. So what can we do to intervene on that kind of representational and institutional violence? And so I just wanted to mention that while Fusako has been in prison, there has been this support group called Oribe no Ki, Olive Tree. And so we've been talking about setting up this transnational branch to support Fusako. And I just wanted to give a shout out to a few members of this transnational branch of Oribe no Ki. First to Kota Kimura, who is the podcaster of this amazing new podcast called Against Japanism. And I'm very grateful to the work that you're doing to create a platform for Mei and others like her. And also just want to acknowledge that one of our first translation projects, which will be undertaken by Lisa Kuroda, who will be translating one of Fusako's most recent books, Kakumei no Kisetsu, Palestina no Senba Kara, basically Seasons of Our Revolution, not my revolution, but our revolution from the battlefield of Palestine. And then, so on this last just slide that I hope you can see, Mei's Twitter handle and Facebook are there. So if you are interested, in keeping in touch with us as we undertake this international transnational solidarity project together, please reach out to me or Mei. I'm sure it will be easy enough to find us. So that being said, just for my closing words, I just want to say that together we need to not only rewrite history for the future, but together as a collective, we can do so much more. That it's time to invent and disrupt business as usual and collectively act out so that others who struggle to breathe can live. So I just want to thank you, Mei, for agreeing to be a visiting scholar here with us. And I'm honored to work by your side and learn from you. And thank all of my fellow panelists today for creating this space together so we can come together to discuss the legacy of your mother, who will soon in 88 days be free with you.